Hey friends, what's going on? Time to put those math hoodies on. It's Mr. Stanley. How are you today? Let's get rocking and rolling with some math. I'm using the Math Learning Center app that you can either download or use on your Chromebook. And if not, there are some workbook pages that I'm going to refer to in a minute. Today we're going to explore halves on a Geoboard. So I'd like for you to get out your Geoboard halves sheet that looks like this. It's from pages 213 and 214 in your student workbook. So today, our job is to find out how many different ways you can find to divide the square into Geoboard halves. So these are multiple Geoboards, and we're trying to figure out how to put them in halves. And this is to record them here. Put a star by the boards that show halves that are not the same shape and size, but take up the same amount of area. So some of those are going to get a little wonky, but the first thing I wanted to do is just show you one way we could do this is I like to use the grid down here in the bottom. I just put the grid here, and that tells me, if you take a notice here, that you'll see that it makes my giant square into smaller little squares. And as you can see, a square, as you know, is 4 congruent sides on the outside, but it also relates to multiplication and division. If you count them by ones, you'll get 16. And if you do a 4 by 4 array, you'll get 16. 4 down, up and down, and 4 across, or 4 rows or columns of 4. So what we're thinking about, though, is we're thinking about how to divide this up into 2 halves of 8, because half of 16 is 8. But there are simple ways to think about this. So I'm just going to take my rubber band and I'm going to make a big square. Now I'm going to take that square and I'm going to chop it up. Let's use blue. So one way I can do that is this. So now that I've made that, I'm just going to record that on my Geoboard half, and that's half. I have half on this side, half on that side. I'd like you to pause the video and see how many different ways you can use to find a half on a Geoboard. Okay, now that you're back, now we're going to take a look at some more possibilities. You may have come up with something that looks like this, or maybe on the opposite side, you have something that looks like this. Those are perfectly acceptable. Maybe you took it and put it here in the middle. Notice how I have 8 spots in the top, and I also have 8 spots in the bottom as well. So that's just kind of a little checker for me. So when I do this on the diagonal, I know that splits it into half. But what's unique about this is that we start to look at this giant square as little pieces of a fraction. So I can count my squares. I know I need 8 because there should be 8 on both sides. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. But then I have these little halfer guys. So these halfers are going to make 7. These 2 halfers are going to be the 8th one if I put them together. And then I have an exact symmetrical mirrored side on the other side. So these 2 are the same as well. 5. That's a 5. 6 and 7, 8. Okay, so now we have 2 separate sides that have a half on each. Okay, so now we know that we can split these tiny little boxes into halves to make 2 of them to make them into halves. So pause the video once again, and I'd like you to go back to your page and start recording some of these that you found. So an example that I gave you was this one. I did this one. I'm going to label each of my halves so that you can tell. I might even want to grid them in color. Some students like to get out a colored pencil and they like to grid it just like I did, so that they can go through and count their squares to make sure they have 8 squares or tinier squares out of the 16 that they need. And then we also found another one that went across like that. So those are the most common that go from corner to corner, side to side, and top to bottom. But you might find some others. Pause the video and work on trying to find Geoboard halves. Okay, now that we're back, I'd like you to take a look at maybe some of the ones that might be a little bit different. So if I take my rubber band and I make it look like this, this could also be one as well. So now we're going to start to get strange. So now I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 squares on one side, and then I must have 8 squares on the other side as well, out of my giant big square in the middle. So I know I have half and half. Then we can get even more bizarre. Some of you might have found that we can do something that looks like this. This almost looks ziggy-zaggy here. And then I know I'm going to have 8 on one side because I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, which is this whole, these two half pieces make up 6, 7, and 8. So there you have it. Okay. So on these, you have halves on a Geoboard. So continue to find some of the ones, and that you might find some that are slightly irregular or slightly off, that you might want to put a star beside, because some of these, they don't quite, aren't quite the same on both sides. For instance, let me try this one right here. This is an interesting one. So if I went from here, so let me get my eraser off. If I went from here to here, and then I go here and then here, these are a little different because it's still a half, but at the same time I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, but then I've got this 8, which is an odd part. But I have the same on this side too, but I've got to make those squares so that I know I have half on one side and half on the other. So I have 8 little boxes on one side, 8 little boxes on the other. See how many that you can find that are. But be careful, because sometimes you might grab a rubber band, and you might find that when you grab your rubber band, you might have something that pulls down, and it might not necessarily be half. So it might be, it might look a little strange like this. So this up here, I need you to be careful that this is not quite half. So if you look at this little area up here, I have less of this part of that square, and I have way more of this part of this square. So if I were to make a half out of that, I would need the opposite, almost the opposite side of that somewhere else on the board to look like this, only in reverse. So that's kind of the challenge, is to find some of those odd ones where you know you have an equal amount of half of this Geoboard. So today's assignment is to finish up our Geoboard's halves page and do as many as you can. There's actually 2 pages available for you to finish this. And then when you're finished, there is a practice page on page 215, which is also included in our slides for today. Have a great day, everybody.